everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today I'm going to do a little tutorial on how to use the wool tincture dyes. My way to get a tonal yarn. I have a full review of this product where I followed the instructions they gave a little bit more closely than what I'm going to do in this video. In the other video I used a glass jar. I'm going to use a dye kettle because it's going to be easier for me to look at the little dye tea bags and things. But first, what are wool tincture dyes? These are acid dyes inside basically a tea bag. So then you can brew your dye bath very easily without having to measure out your dyes. Similar, there's a packet of citric acid that then you can add into your dye bath to then get those desired colors that you want really easily. This turquoise I'm going to use now came as like a duo pack with a purple, and I dyed the purple already. So let's go and do the turquoise. Now, if you're going to play with these dyes, I recommend you go to the Wool Tincture website because they have full instructions there, which do work. The two big caveats that I want to give. You want to make sure that all of the tools and equipment you are using is dedicated for dyeing yarn and is never used for the preparation of food. And I also recommend that for safety wise, you wear safety glasses, a respirator mask or N95 mask when you're dealing with the dry dye powders, and gloves when you're touching the products. But that's my preference. And the one thing I think that recommendation that they did not give there that I feel obligated to give. And I guess disclosures wise, I did buy these dyes myself, but I am a KnitPicks affiliate and you can purchase these dyes through KnitPicks. And so if you make any purchases through my links, I do have links and affiliate links down in the video description, I will earn a commission. Okay, so to use this dye, the main difference I'm going to use is a stainless steel dye pot. This is an 8-quart pot. I'm going to be able to fit a lot more water in it. And it's going to be easier for us to like look at the tea bag of dye and things as we are working. Other materials I have on hand, I have some tongs. I have just like a extra pan to put the dirty dye packets. My work surface is protected with a shower curtain. I have a little trivet here, and I have an electric kettle. That's a dedicated dye kettle that I'll be using to heat up the water in. Ah, yes. But the last thing is that I have 100 grams of Stroll fingering weight yarn that I pre-soaked in some plain tap water with no additional acid. I soaked this it's been soaking for at least an hour at room temperature. And then of course, we have our packet. And each packet comes with 2 of the dyes packets, 2 of the citric acid packets in it. And really, the process that we're going to do is going to be very similar to this. We're going to add the dye into the kettle. We're going to pour warm water on top. We're going to remove the tea bag, soak the yarn in here for a couple of minutes, then add the citric acid, stir things up, and let everything sit at room temperature to cool off completely. And so the main change that I'm doing from the instructions is that instead of using a jar, like they recommend, I'm using a kettle because my jar is way smaller than what they recommend. And so it worked to use, I think I used 5 cups of water. We have 6 cups in here total. It's working, but I think having a little bit more space will be a little bit easier to work with. I put on my respirator mask because I'm going to be dealing with dry dye powder. I'm going to pull out, so we have the 2 packets. I'm going to bring out one of the packets of citric acid. I really appreciate that the tea bags are in like a wax container because there is some fallout. Some of the dye does fall out of the tea bag itself, and so at least if I shake it or something, the dye's going to go in this container versus on my counter or something. Okay, so now into my kettle. I'm going to take my tea bag. Is it open? Oh, funny. I didn't even realize. Oh, no, it's sewn tight. That's cool. All right, I'm going to put my tea bag in. And I'm bringing over with my no longer boiling water to pour this over the tea bag. And ooh, this turquoise is a very lovely green.
And I like that this time I can see the dye come out. Now I'm adding 1.5 liters of hot water, which is less than what their instructions say to use. But that's what fits in my kettle, so that's what I'm going to use. And this is more than I used last time. Now at this point, let's see, is there any dye left in here? But all the dye is wet, so I'm comfortable removing my respirator mask.
Which means you can hear me better. Okay, but actually this dissolved really, really quickly. I want to give things a good stir, and I'm going to remove the tea bag, set it into that container back there, and bring over our yarn. Now, one thing I did not mention, I like to add a zip tie onto my yarn, so that way I can pick up the yarn by it, and I find that really handy. You don't have to, but it means that as I come and stir yarn in a dye bath, I am much less likely to tangle it than I might otherwise. Ooh, this is a very pretty color and feels very true to the swatch right now. So now we're gonna wait 2 minutes for this to just sit with the dye a little bit before I bring in the citric acid powder. So I guess while we're waiting, 2 things I would note. If you're using a glass jar, you want to warm it with warm water before you pour in the hot water, so that way you don't crack the glass. That's one warning they have in their instructions. And the other thing that I would say is that if you're filling a glass jar, make sure you leave enough space as you're adding the water, so that way you can add the yarn in. And one way you can test that is that you could, if you have your jar, say right here, you could take your pre-soaking yarn, put it in the jar, fill it with water, remove the yarn, and then see where that water level is. Then you know how much water to add. Ultimately, the volume of water, if we're letting all the dye absorb onto the yarn, is not going to affect the color, but having more water makes it easier to get more even color coverage on your yarn. And right here I'm using superwash yarn, which will absorb colors faster than non-superwash yarn. And so we can test this on some non-superwash yarn at another time if that's something that you would like to see. But I'm not expecting the colors to strike yet because we have not yet added any acid. So there's still a lot of color in there. Now, I'm a little curious about the turquoise because bright blues tend to need more heat and time and things like that to absorb. But actually, one thing I can do that is I could do that's similar to the instructions is now I actually will have enough space to move the yarn to the side to add the citric acid packet. And I suppose I'm calling this video how I would do this. And I want to do this a little bit the way they did it and just stir things up. Because if I was adding vinegar, which is what I often use as my acid source, I would just sort of pour it in. Let's see, that should have all dissolved. There's maybe a hair left. Oh yeah, there's a little bit left in there. It's a little hard to see with the tea bags if all is there or not. See, there's like just a tiny bit with the corner. I stir the yarn in here and up, we can see I see the dye bath getting lighter because with acid dyes you need heat and acid and a wool-based yarn. These packets, which I'm now going to remove, that citric acid, a little packet, these dyes will not work on plant-based fibers, or plant-based fibers or synthetics like acrylic. And in just that like minute of time, almost all of the color is in the yarn. Now here I can see some tonal variation, and I am going to be leaving the yarn in here until it cools off completely. So I want to see, I don't know if it's showing up on camera, that there's lighter patches and darker patches. If you want the color on your yarn to be more even, use a larger volume of water. The more water you have, you might need to add more citric acid because the pH will get higher, I guess, with the more volume you add. But I think that that's enough citric acid that you should be fine with a lot more water. But I would have more water for more even color, so that way you can really stir it there. But part of dyeing hand-dyed yarn is that the colors aren't perfectly even. And so that's one of the things that I personally really love. Now, I'm gonna set a timer for 30 minutes because that's how long I usually will heat set my yarn for. Now the color has all absorbed and I can feel it's warm. I just wanna test and see how warm the pot is still feeling after those 30 minutes are up. So that way we just have a good feel for that and can feel confident in not having the yarn over a heat source. Even though, if we look at it, all the color is in our yarn. But you know, more heat isn't gonna hurt anything, and I just feel more comfortable letting it cool off completely in the dye bath here. Or at least being exposed to heat for 30 minutes. Overall, I found that these dyes are really easy to use. There's not a lot of cleanup, even though I intentionally created fallout. I would still recommend wiping your surfaces really, really well in the end. But I'm impressed that things did not strike super unevenly on my superwash yarn. I intentionally picked superwash yarn because I know that typically you need, sometimes with some colors for me, I will see colors start to strike to the yarn or bind to the yarn before I've even added acid. And so things didn't clear with hot water and dye. And so that's good. There's a good amount of dye there. I was able to get good coverage, even using less water on our very superwash yarn. I'm curious to see if just sitting at room temperature, if this will work on some non-superwash and maybe like alpaca blends or something, but that's something I'll try at another time. I do think this is an extremely beginner-friendly product, and I'm excited about that. I am really impressed that this color all struck as fast as it did. And also that we got as good of coverage as we got on the yarn. My tap water is slightly acidic, and so sometimes I'll see dyes striking really quickly. And turquoise and bright blues sometimes need more acid and more time. So the amount of citric acid in that packet is pretty darn good for making this work. It's been 30 minutes and I would say the dye bath is still warm. It's not hot, but again, all of the dye absorbed, which even in those first few minutes, so we're very happy about that. The one thing I don't know is if it would work this well in non-superwash yarn. So that's something to investigate at some point. But anyway, I'm gonna let this finish cooling off completely, just because that's what the instructions recommend, and it's not gonna hurt the yarn to cool in the dye bath. If I had this at a sustained temperature, I would remove the yarn now. But since we're leaving it and letting it cool, may as well just let it cool as long as it needs. Let's wash our turquoise yarn. And it's mostly cooled off, but we did see all the color is in our yarn. And so the proof in the pudding is gonna be at this washing stage. And it was at least an hour from when we added things together, and the yarn was pretty much at room temperature. If you're using non-superwash yarn, you wanna make sure it's completely cool before you wash it. But here, you can see we have more tonal variation in this one than the first one. But I'm gonna rinse with cool water. I'm gonna add some dish soap. So what's the purpose of the rinsing? We want to remove any excess dye is one, but also by adding the water and rinsing it, we're removing the citric acid and we're neutralizing it again. Now, citric acid, I could put my hands into the citric acid mixture and there's nothing dangerous or harmful there. It's more of, I don't want to dye my skin, and so that's why I wear gloves. Now, I'm seeing the tiniest amount of color bleeding, which you can see there, like a hint of colors coming out with soap. I'm not concerned by that because it's so little. If we were seeing bright blue come out, I would want to reheat set this, steam set it, and give it a lot more heat, acid, and time, because blues can sometimes be trickier. But a tiny amount is not a cause for concern, especially if it's gonna resolve quickly, which I think it will. Now, I don't think the original instructions include using soap, but I like to use soap just because sometimes if there is unbound dye, it helps flush it out. But anyway, I am gonna go put this through my spin dryer to remove the water. It's sort of like a spin cycle on a washing machine, and then go hang it to dry. You could go hang it up to dry right now. It's just the spin dryer makes the drying part take less time. In my full review, I mentioned some of the pros and cons for this product. I think that there are some really good tutorials on the website. I think that some of the instructions could be a little more clear on the packet and really directing you to the full instructions that they have on their website. But if you have a good feel for the basics of dyeing yarn, then this is incredibly easy to use. So I do think that it is a good product for that. And I will have linked in the description both of the wool tincture dyes from where I bought them through KnitPicks. I'll have my KnitPicks affiliate link down there. But I will also link directly to the website of the manufacturer because they have full instructions there. And I think it's cool that you can get dye jars through them as well that are big enough for their tutorials. I used what I had on hand with my dedicated dye stuff. And $22 to dye 400 grams of yarn is a little bit pricey, but I did the math at one point and it would be cheaper for someone to do this than it would be for them to go and buy, say, the yarn that I dyed with these packets. Which, when I price them on my website, I'm not going to be factoring in the expense of the dyes. I will kind of keep that normal, like normalized at my normal hand-dyed price. But I think that since the target is for a new dyer versus an indie dyer with a business who sells hand-dyed yarn, the cost isn't that bad anymore. I do think it might be easier for someone to go and find a large glass jar that they can have as a dedicated dye vessel than it can be to go find a dye pot. Like I'm using my stainless steel pot that I've been using for a very long time. I guess I've had the pot like 6 years, maybe? Longer? I've had it a long time. So you can take things with a grain of salt, but if you're tempted to try more dyeing techniques, I have tons of videos here on this channel that not only are tutorials, but you can go to the beginning of Dyepot Weekly and watch my journey and hesitations and nerves as I started dyeing yarn with acid dyes. And yeah, some of those videos are old, but I tried to share my successes and failures, and so it's worth subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss a new video. Here is the finished yarn, and I feel like the color, since it's, I wouldn't call it bright, but it's something about the color makes it really hard to see the tonal variation that's in there on camera. Like I really see it in person, but looking at the monitor on my camera, I'm not sure if it's coming through. So let's twist up the yarn, because sometimes that makes it a little more obvious. There, here you can see the differences in the color. It's very subtle. This would work really well with lace or complex stitch patterns because it is so subtle, but it is imperfectly perfect. I love soft, subtle tonal variation because I think that that is a quality of hand-dyed yarn that gives a project something special. And I like that it's not repeating. I mean, I dyed it, so I love it. I think the biggest tip I can give with this is that you don't need to overthink it. And I know from one of the reviews that the differences in instructions between some of the different tutorials can feel nerve-wracking, because if you're trying to follow a recipe to bake a souffle, then you want to have your measurements spot on. But when it comes to yarn, instructions are mostly guidelines, with the exception of safety. But if you combine your dye, your acid, heat, and water together in some kind of way, you're gonna dye your yarn. And part of the fun is starting with doing a tonal like this and then realizing, ooh, how can I change these different components to create something different, to make it my own, to make it my perfect yarn that I want to work with. And I'm happy to be here to help because I have hundreds of videos here on my channel, thousands, that can help you on your yarn dyeing journey. And if you want to learn more about the wool tincture dyes, I will have my Knit Picks affiliate link in the video description, but I'll also have a link to the wool tincture dyes website itself, so you can go learn more over there. And again, this video is not sponsored or anything. I just wanted to play around with these dyes the way that I would use them. And so I really hope you enjoyed that. Finally, if you're curious, I got the purple and turquoise duo pack, and oh my gosh, those colors are really spot on. Oh my gosh, that looks so good and true. Now, I suppose before I sign off, I do want to give one troubleshooting thing. I got, a perfect representation of the colors. This isn't because I'm an experienced dyer. This is because I picked a yarn base that shows the colors really true. And I don't remember if I've mentioned this in this video, but when you're playing around with different yarn bases and dyes, you can use the exact same amount of dye on 5 different yarn bases and get some variations of the color, and sometimes even the hue can be a little bit different based on the base color of the bare yarn, or maybe not bare yarn. Are you using an off-white, a pure white that was bleached? What, is it a light brown? But then also different fibers absorb the dyes a little bit differently and then sort of present them to you in a slightly different way. And so if the color wasn't quite what you were hoping for, I think that with these dyes, it would be hard to adjust the color by adding a little bit of blue or a little bit of yellow. That isn't something that is as possible with these, although I suppose you could make some stock solutions, set up a bunch of jars and have like a range of colors that then you mix them together to create your perfect color. So you could play around like that. But yeah, I would say don't despair. In my experience, the colors that the swatches are very, very true. But colors also look different on your screen than they do in person. So I don't know, I think that this is pretty fantastic. Anyway, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.